This computer. Cool. So we're recording now, and yeah, we got like another minute for people to come on. Um, just so you all know, I added a reading at 2:30, so don't feel like you have to read it. It's the introduction to archaeology at Montpelier. It's a little booklet that you'll get when you arrive here. I think we've got more copies of that. I gotta check with the gift shop to make sure they do. So we had a whole box of those in the office. So, but they're not around anymore. Um, but yeah, well, it's 3 o'clock, and we'll go ahead and begin. And what we're Chris and Liz have worked a lot on the virtual syllabus this week, and really appreciate the efforts they put into that. And they asked me to go ahead and start out with an overview of some of the archaeology that we've done at Montpelier over the past 20 or 30 years. But I guess what I'd start with is we're going to do introductions when you all get here you're going to get here on Sunday, and we'll do a dinner on Monday night, and then we'll do introductions with everybody on Tuesday morning, the first day of the field school. So, but has then everybody been able to access the readings and look those over? That's working out. Cool. So there's sometimes the access preferences aren't sometimes get changed, and it's hard to get to things. And if you have any questions, you can email Chris or Liz or myself, and we can help you out with that. I know the other person who's been working on this is Stephen Billy, the public archaeologist. Y'all have interacted with him with registration and application for the field school as well. So, but any other points of business, Chris and Liz, to talk about before we get started?
The only thing I would add is this week, we're gonna be covering a lot of material, and some of it's gonna be very bird's eye view. So, don't worry if there are very particular details that you don't absorb, because you're gonna have all summer to kind of um, not memorize, but like learn it more deeply.
Mhm.
We're just introducing concepts this week that will provide a framework for the rest of the month.
Yeah, and probably the most detail we'll get into is some of what I'm going to be talking about with some of the archaeology at Montpelier. And what I want to frame this as is, like Chris was saying, is just it's an overview of the sites and the history and some of the general trends. And so, like historical trends that we found out through the archaeology. And what we're going to try to do over the next 3 days is relate a lot of these concepts, especially as it pertains to the community-based archaeological work that we do and the work we've done with the descendant community. Oh, I see more people are coming into the waiting room. Um, yeah, Liz and Chris, if y'all see that little notice up there to let people in, I've given talks before, like with expeditions, and it was like half hour in, and somebody was just like sitting there waiting in the waiting room. So that's kind of my worst nightmare. So um, but yeah, one of the big themes for this field school and the work we're doing on the burial ground is work with the descendant community. And actually, the last part of this lecture today, we're going to have Henry Anglin, who's the chair of the memorialization committee. He's a descendant, part of the board member of the MDC, and then Allison James, who's the project director on the memorialization project. We'll be talking with you all about the memorialization project. So, um, and the for a lot of the details on the sites and even the burial ground, we're going to wait till you all get here to go over those because once you're on the landscape, it makes a lot more sense. Hopefully, you all have had a chance to look at the story map on the burial ground. That goes into quite a bit of detail, and that'll provide some really good background for what Henry and Allison are talking about with memorialization, or building a memorial to honor the ancestors at the burial ground, which is, of course, the main goal of our archaeology that we're doing this year, is trying to figure out the extent of the burial ground and how it intersects the area of the memorial. So wanted to have that be one of the concepts we're looking at here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and share screen. But one of the things that we often get into with talking about the landscape is power of place. And when you think of power of place, how many of y'all have heard of power of place? Uh, and what is it? What comes to mind with that when you think about a landscape, like a historic landscape, like at Montpelier?
The like weight of the people who live there and their experiences.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. Absolutely. And, of course, there's different groups of folks. You have the enslavers, the Madisons, who owned the land and owned the people, the enslaved Americans at Montpelier. And then, of course, you have the enslaved community itself. And Carolyn, that probably, it goes, for a specific point in time and through time. Because, today, Montpelier as a historic landscape means something very different to descendants than it does to like the average visitor or us as staff. So there's varying weights that go with that. What else comes to mind with power of place?
I think about how Madison's position of power, and I mean everybody else in the family and those, I guess, in charge of the enslaved community, how their choices, their actions affected the lives of those people.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, the how folks were interacting and how they'd see themselves on the landscape. Yeah, absolutely, Amanda. Thank you. Anybody else? What about just being, on the landscape and, being at a place, at that, there's like what you all are going to be learning about today is, I'm going to be giving a PowerPoint using GIS to show some of these sites. And so there's seeing something virtually, but there's being there literally, on that landscape, being on the land, seeing, being surrounded by the grass, the trees, the site, the landforms. And that's a part that brings a lot of visitors to Montpelier, and is very much all in encompassing and contextualizing. But with all this, one of the things that really gives a lot of inspiration to so many people, especially descendants, is the lands, how the landscape holds the history, and literally holds the history. And for some of you all that have, for some of the background readings, don't know if you've read about how much of the documentary record that pertains to the retirement years, the period that we're restoring Montpelier to, was destroyed by the Madison family after when Dolly Madison sells the property in 1844. All of the records go to her son's house in Toddsburg and outside of Gordonsville. And when he dies in the 1850s, all of Madison's nieces and nephews go to his house. This is Madison's stepson, and finds literally 2 rooms full of documents that relate to Montpelier, and bring them all out to the backyard and burn them. And with that goes, lists of the enslaved, the plats of the land, showing where fields are, where buildings are. All this is gone. And approximately 10 years before that, Dolly Madison had sold the enslaved community. This is, a community that had been at Montpelier for over 100 years. And with the sale of the community, because folks are sold down to Richmond and into the deep South. This is, part of the transcontinental slave trade that happens after the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Families are broken up, and so oral history isn't able to be passed on from one generation to the next. And so with these two events in less than 10 years apart, you really, a lot of the record of the enslaved disappears. The documentary record and the oral history. And what's left is what is in the ground. What we found at Montpelier is within the 2,650 acres we have, there's just an incredible set of preservation in the landscape. Much of the land, when Dolly Madison sold it in 1844, is basically remains untouched. It returns to woods, and the sites are basically, never plowed it, throughout the next 150 years. And for this reason, the MDC refers to the landscape as a memory device, because in that landscape, you've got the archaeology, and that archaeology serves as the memory of what their ancestors did, what they accomplished on the landscape. And that's an inspiration for us, where the archaeology in and of itself lends to the power of the place. It's information that's in the ground, and that's what you all are going to be experiencing over the next month, is how we use that to not only the archaeology that's on the landscape, that not only tell the history of the enslaved community, but also working with a group whose heritage, whose legacy is really embodied in that landscape, which is the descendant community. And so, you have different levels of investment for groups of people. And, for some, the archaeology at Montpelier, people are curious about it and they want to learn about it, being a visitor. Others have made it into a career, like a lot of us here. You all are going to be using it as a way to learn archaeology and become involved in it. But for descendants, they see the archaeology as, really the ability to learn about their ancestral connection to the land and who their ancestors are, because all the record of their ancestors is gone. Any kind of lists of who their family was and what they did is not present in the documentary record. Much of that oral history is broken because of the sale of families. And then you've got this landscape. So with that, I mean, that for us, the power of place in so many ways, it's that connection with descendants that's huge for us. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow with public archaeology, community archaeology, and the clientage model. But we're working with the MDC to ensure that decision making happens through descendants, and they're part of this archaeological process. And over the course of the next month, you all are going to get to know and meet a lot of descendants, because they're going to be very involved because of the site we're working on, which is the burial ground of their ancestors. So a really important space. So any questions? And if anyone has any questions, don't feel like you have to wait for me to pause. Just jump in. And a lot of this is new, so you might not know what to ask. But if you do, go ahead and don't hesitate to break the silence with your mic. So, but anybody have any questions so far before I share screens and get into using the GIS maps? All right, cool. I will go ahead and share screens here. And let's see. There we go. And yeah, and you all should be able to see the map right here. Can everybody see the map? Okay, cool. I'm on the right screen. You got 3 screens here. It can be confusing at times. But what Montpelier is, this area that's outlined in brown right here. This is the 2,650 acres that make up Montpelier today. And where Montpelier is located, if you zoom out on this map, is we're in what's called Central Virginia. So here's Montpelier, here's Orange County right here, and then here's the state of Virginia along the East Coast. So we're a little bit north central Virginia right here. And Montpelier itself is situated along what's called the Southwest Mountains. It's this line of in the Piedmont of this ridge of mountains that runs along here right before you get to the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is where Shenandoah National Park is located. and the Montpelier originally was the ancestral home of the Manahoac, which is the late woodland indigenous tribe group that was in Virginia, in central Virginia, and they're adjacent to the Monacan Nation. And so a lot of y'all have probably heard about the Powhatan. They were more down in the Jamestown area in the eastern part of the state, and they were oftentimes were at odds with the Manahoac and the Monacan nations. And for Montpelier, the area of the Manahoac that the Madisons and the enslaved Africans that they kidnapped and brought over from Africa occupied was a landscape that where a lot of the more permanent Manahoac settlements were on the river, the Rapidan River, which is shown in blue right here. And there's a number of villages that were located along the river. In fact, the lowest point of the river right along here, there's a famous mound called Rapidan Mound right about in this area. And actually one of the staff here, Jenny Spencer, who's a graphics artist, it's on her family land where Rapidan Mound is. And for Montpelier, though, we're in the higher elevation area above the river basin of the Rapidan River. And so what we found in the work we've been doing is that while we don't have any large settlements dating to the late woodland, all of this landscape was an indigenous landscape. We've found all across the property sites dating from the early woodland into the contact period, and at sites such as where we've worked over the past 5 years at the home farm in this area right in here. Show you an aerial view of this. The home farm, we found a number of Native American sites, indigenous sites at historic sites. And so these are, a lot of them are late archaic sites. And then over at the main house, which is up in this area, in the main house, we found a number of sites that date to the late woodland. In fact, some of the sites we've excavated there, especially in the back lawn where we found a buried 18th century subsoil or topsoil, we found large amounts of Native American indigenous ceramics that date to the middle woodland and the late woodland period. And a lot of these were disturbed in the 18 teens with all the landscaping that happened. And we'll talk more about that in this today. But one of the sites that we found that dates to the contact period is and to give you a reference of where we are on the map right here. Again, this is the 2,650 acres. This brown outline is the property line that marks the land that's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and operated by Montpelier. And the visitor center, and first, how many of y'all have ever been to Montpelier? So I see, yeah. So a couple of y'all have. Awesome. I don't have everybody on the screen here. Let me see. I'll drag this out so we get, yeah. So, but for what most people see when they come to Montpelier is this is the main house right here. Here's the main house. The visitor center where you park your car is right here on the landscape. And this is about right in the middle of the 2,650 acres. And where most people walk is between the Madison Family Cemetery down here, where James Madison is buried, the burial ground, the Montpelier burial ground of the enslaved, where we're doing the archaeology, and the woodlot right here, and then up to the main house. But Montpelier has all kinds of other sites across the property, especially in these wooded areas. For example, up on Chicken Mountain, right in this area, we did metal detector surveys, and one of the sites that we found up in this area was I gotta turn the sights on because it's so hard to see some of these sites without this, is we found a very small, what appeared to be a tobacco barn right on top of Chicken Mountain. These are excavation units that we put here in 2017. This is Dennis Bajorkland, our metal detectorist. You'll be meeting him in about a week. But what we found were a number of indigenous ceramics that are from the contact period. And so this is a site that we believe was either occupied during the historic period by Manahoac, or there was trading that occurred between the enslaved and the Manahoac, which is most likely what was going on in this area. So this is one of the earliest sites that we found. And then, of course, one of the main early sites we've got at Montpelier is the Mount Pleasant site. And at the Mount Pleasant site, this is the original farm complex for the first generation of the Madison family, under who's it was run under Frances Madison, the grandmother of the president. What we found at Mount Pleasant, this site was occupied from the 1720s up until about 1761 when Frances Madison passes away. We found a number of contact period artifacts like this groundstone celt. We found very small quartz points that are called birding points. They're from the contact era. And then one of the few areas where we found a number of colonoware. Does anyone know what colonoware is? Yeah, what's colonoware? Christina?
So I think that there's kind of a debate about it, but from what I can tell, colonoware is often thought about like as pottery that's made by enslaved Africans on a site that kind of melds pottery traditions from mostly West Africa with Native American pottery traditions.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's, in this part of the Piedmont, the only area where we found colonoware is at some of these earlier sites, and also in context where we've also found late woodland contact era artifacts that were probably Manahoac. So the question is there an interaction occurring between the enslaved Africans and the Manahoac for creating these ceramics, or are Manahoac trading ceramics like low-fired earthenware pipes with the enslaved African Americans who are living at the site? So there's, like you said, Christina, there's a lot of questions that still remain unanswered. I know when I worked at Manassas Battlefield, we were finding what was called colonoware on early 19th century sites, and evidence was speaking to those wares being made by enslaved Americans or free blacks in the area. So it's hard to say, but once you get into the 19th century, a lot of the colonoware is not present on the sites. We don't find a lot of it. But so for one of the earliest sites we've got, that's one of the larger sites, is Mount Pleasant. And Mount Pleasant, when it's being occupied, Mount Pleasant was occupied from the 1720s up until the 1760s. And during this time, Frances Madison is operating the plantation as a tobacco farm. So there's a lot of what would be called Swidden style architecture that was where hoes would be used. Enslaved farmers would use hoes to hoe the tobacco into hills. It's very intensive land clearing that occurred. And during this entire period, Frances Madison is operating the plantation, and her son, eldest son, James Madison Sr., when he marries Nellie Conway Madison in 1759, in 1749, they end up not living at Mount Pleasant, but further up the hill at what would become the main house, or Montpelier. And the site we found pretty recently, about 10 years ago, that relates to that site is a site called the South Kitchen. And what turns out that the South Kitchen is what appears to be a planter's cottage. So this structure, here's a picture of Liz from about 10 years ago, where she had uncovered the top of this chimney and close to the foundation of the building. And the style of the chimney indicated that it was potentially this planter's cottage that was built in the 1750s. And at this time, the reason why James Madison Sr. and Nellie Conway Madison are living away from Mount Pleasant is they're trying to set up their own household separate from Madison's grandmother, Frances Madison. And at this time, what James Madison Sr. is doing is he's starting to diversify the economy at Montpelier. And one of the things that he does during this time period is he sets up a large blacksmith shop where over by where the temple is today, which is the kind of the iconic building for Montpelier, we found this 18th century blacksmith shop that dates to the American Revolution, where we found literally an acre of blacksmithing debris all across the landscape. And one of the things that comes from this blacksmith shop is that probably the reason why James Madison Sr. is having a blacksmith operate here is he's selling goods to the local community. So his mom is marketing tobacco under her name and exporting those goods. And what he does is starts to kind of come into the local economy. And with this, it diversifies Montpelier in such a way that not only is there a wider range of skilled enslaved artisans at Montpelier, but also when you get into the American Revolution and the bottom falls out of the tobacco economy, Montpelier is also reliant on the local economy, selling goods to local other farmers and plantation owners, and it allows Montpelier to prosper into the late 18th century. And this is how literally Madison is able to pursue his political career, because instead of going into debt in the late 18th century, they're still having a profitable plantation. And during this time, shortly after Francis Madison dies in 1761, James Madison Jr. and his wife Nellie Conway Madison, there's an image of them. They arranged to have the main house built, which at the time was this Georgian structure with these outbuildings. And how they changed the economy is they have the enslaved begin to do some of the earliest plowing in the Virginia Piedmont. And so rather than relying on tobacco horticulture through the Revolution, by the 1760s, they're starting to grow grains and diversify the agricultural economy. And this really produces even more profits for the Madisons. And so when you get into the time period of the 18 teens, which is the time period that we've restored the main house to. So when you look at Montpelier today, what you've got is a structure that embodies all of these earlier buildings, like the 18th century building between these two chimneys. All the wings here are added on the 18 teens. But when the wings are added, what James Madison Jr., the future president, is relying on is all of this wealth that's been generated by 2 generations of Madisons and over 4 generations of enslaved workers, farmers, blacksmiths, a whole line of folks that know enough about the land to be able to work with the enslavers to produce a lot of profit. And we're going to get into a lot of the discussions about some of the nuances of this, and how what we discovered with the archaeology isn't just about the labor that you typically see and you think about when you think about enslaved Americans, but some of the intellectual contributions that they made and how we're able to see this through the archaeology. And so again, what I want to do today is just kind of go over a really, really brief thumbnail sketch of the history of Montpelier. And so much of this, how we've understood this is not just through a lot of archaeology that we've done. So for example, let me close some of these windows here, otherwise my computer gets crazy. Let's see, you can get back to the map without closing the map. When you look at the landscape here, just to give you a sense, we work in 5x5 units. And who knows what a 5x5 unit is? What is a 5x5 unit? What am I talking about there? Yeah, Percy, you raised your hand. Or are you just stretching?
I mean, it's your standard test unit. You do 5 feet by 5 feet.
Nice. Yeah, that's our standard excavation unit. And so when you look at the map right here, here's the main house. And when you zoom in, what you begin to see is all these 5x5. So these are all units that previous field schools and, probably about 25 seasons of excavations we've excavated here at Montpelier. So, if you look at this map, so much of the area of the main house is just covered with excavation units. And let me see, when you zoom out and you look at other areas, for example, like the South Yard, you've got lots and lots of units that have been excavated. But what we've been able to do is really, through 30 seasons of excavations, we've had not just an accumulation of information, but also seasons that have informed us about what we've found previous seasons. So that's a really cool thing about doing archaeology at a site for so long is, 25 years ago, we found things that we didn't even understand. And then, 10 years later, we'd find them in a different context and be like, oh my God, that stuff we were finding in like 2002, it was this, and it related to this trench that goes all the way across the main house, like the water line that we found that goes all the way across here. This water line that's located in this area right here, this wooden water pipe, is one that was found in the 1990s. But then later on, we found a brick drain that relates to it. So, just all this stuff connects, which is really cool. So, but rather than get into all the details like what that brick drain is, and we'll get into that when you do a tour of the South Yard, what I wanted to do was to give you, a sense of some of the time periods that we've discovered. So, and what we've been able to do with the archaeology, for example, is, for this 18th century house that, is shown in this 3D model right here, there's no print or drawing that shows what Montpelier during the American Revolution looked like. This is based on the archaeology. So this building that's right here, we discovered this in this area. This is these set of units right here that we found, this brick foundation. And so when you zoom in on this map, what you see is all these units that we excavated, and then here's the brick foundation for this structure that we were able to figure out where it was located. So all this brick here is the brick that shows up in this GIS map right here. And Chris and Liz shared with you all this GIS map. So you all can, zoom in and click on things and really explore. But what I'd suggest you all do is when you have a chance to have a break, maybe once you get here, because you're gonna have a lot of readings too beyond this, is we're going to give you a little archaeology booklet. And it has, I put that as a PDF in this document. But look through that, because that has it's my favorite because that is some of the best pictures over the past 20 years of some of the archaeology that we've done. And it's kind of like it'll be a guide that you can use on a lot of the tours that we give you. So getting into the 19th century, when you look at, much of what you see at Montpelier today is this 19th century house. And so what we've restored Montpelier to is its 1820s appearance. And this is because it's the time period that we have the most documentary information on, with visitors' accounts of, all these elite visitors that visited the Madisons during their retirement years after James and Dolly finished in the White House in 1817. So there's lots of visitors' accounts. It's a time period for which there's some of the few drawings of Montpelier. So for example, the front yard here, you've got this image of a watercolor by Baroness Hyde de Neuville that was painted in October of 1818. Then it shows the front fence and the wings in place and the temple out here in the front yard. It's kind of a bizarre abstract of the landscape. But then in terms of the archaeology, what we've found with the units that we've excavated is so many of these units, when you go through the topsoil at the main house and at sites all across Montpelier, you get below that topsoil and you're at that 1830s surface, that surface that was abandoned when Dolly Madison sold all of the enslaved families beginning in the late 1820s. So when Dolly Madison sells the families, by 1844, everyone sold at Montpelier, a lot of the buildings, for example, in the South Yard, which is, and who knows what the South Yard is? And that way I can get a drink. Anybody know what the South Yard is from some of your readings or even just visiting here? Oh, yeah, Thomas, what's the South Yard?
I could be wrong. Isn't that where the slave quarters are?
Yeah, it's where the homes of the enslaved are located, like the duplexes right here. These structures that we found through the archaeology back in 2011, and when you and then what we've done with this area is we've actually used the archaeology to reconstruct these buildings on the landscape, and we'll get into some of the history of this and how that came about. But this archaeology in the South Yard was some of the really the most engaging archaeology that we did. And when we were doing work in the South Yard in 2015, it's a time period that we had made a lot of connection with descendants. And it's where we started to really get large numbers of descendant community members involved in the archaeology through our week-long programs. And it's where what we started to do was not just engage descendants about what archaeology is, but also engage descendants about what this archaeology means. And that's where we get a lot of direction. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, about what kind of questions we ask about the archaeology and how we make these interpretations. And so one of the things that, when we had done work in the South Yard, we had spent, about almost 20 years focusing on the area around the main house. And one of the things descendants wanted to know about was, about more than just their ancestors who were enslaved and worked at the main house, but about the majority of the enslaved that worked on the larger farm complex. And so what we've got at Montpelier right below the visitor center is we've got this area that we call the home farm. And the home farm is this set of sites that, here's the visitor center right here, here's the main house right here. All this area through here contains close to 40 acres of about 16 buildings. And it was very intensely occupied in the 1820s. And similar to the main house, when we opened up units in this area, what we'd find is we'd go, through the topsoil and then quite rapidly be down into, and all these 5 foot by 5 foot units, we'd be down into this very rich, 1830s landscape that was just full of artifacts and had never been plowed. And so what we've gained from the archaeology is what's most visible and what's most present is this last period of occupation. And the number of enslaved that were living at Montpelier, say in the 18 teens and 1820s, was about 120 enslaved Americans at one time. There were just as many enslaved in the 1780s and 1790s, but that time period just is not as visible archaeologically. We don't find the number of sites as we do related to the 19th century. And much of this is because this 19th century landscape, when Dolly Madison sold the enslaved community in the 1830s, 1840s, these sites were abandoned and never touched again. Whereas with the 18th century landscape, remember up at the main house, when you're looking up here, you've got this 18th century landscape that has, all these outbuildings here. And then in the 18 teens, when the Madisons arranged for the wings to be added on the house, they get rid of those buildings and plant this larger planted landscape. So there, some of those sites are preserved, others of them are landscaped away. So what we've been able to discover is that, as we go out and we've done surveys, is so much of the property has sites that date to the 1820s. So for example, if you, does anybody know what LIDAR is? Christina, you're nodding your head. What's LIDAR? Sorry, you shouldn't nod your head. So,
I think Caroline had their hand raised, not to.
all right, Caroline, you've been called. So, boom.
I did. It's just hard to know like who's like raising their hand or shaking their head with the screen share. But it's
Yeah.
like I don't remember what it stands for, but it's a way of like imaging, like basically like X-ray, but for the ground.
Yeah,
Like just
exactly.
like seeing what's under the ground without having to excavate it right away.
It's essentially like if you got a chainsaw and cut down everything, get rid of all the vegetation. And what this is called is a bare earth model, which means all the overlying trees are removed, virtually, not literally, but virtually with this model. And what you can see is, all this terrain landscape, not only these erosional gullies and here, but also ancient road traces that are running through the property. Like, for example, these right here, this is a road trace dating to the 18th century. And also in the East Woods, and this is one of the areas we're going to explore with you all, and y'all have readings on this, is we found all these agricultural ditches that were drainage canals that allowed for some of these bottomlands in the 1830s to be planted in tobacco. And you can literally see the last set of plow furrows that were turned in this soil by the enslaved before this area was abandoned and turned, back into woods, beginning around the time of the Civil War. And so what we found is, even in these woodlots, I mean, again, if you take away, put the woods back, what is today is woods. If you're visiting here in the 1820s, this would have been farmland. And the evidence for that can not only be seen with the metal detector surveys that we do. For example, this building right here, this is a tobacco barn that we found through metal detector survey, like about 5 years before we had the LiDAR maps. But once we did the metal detector survey and did excavations and figured out the building that it was a tobacco barn, that's where we then used the LiDAR maps and figured out where those tobacco fields are. And so what we've been using over the past decade is a combination of, standard archaeological survey, what are called shovel test pits, which are these little holes that we dig in the ground. And Liz and Chris will be talking about this in about 5 minutes with the back introduction to archaeology. But then also combining that with metal detector survey and then also LiDAR surveys. And so a really good example of that can be seen in the site we're going to be working on, which is the burial ground. And so at the burial ground, what we've got is essentially it's a woodlot, and we know from some of the work that we've done that there are depressions in the ground that were most likely graves. Is that with doing the looking at the LiDAR surveys, what we're able to see is there's this area where you've got this mounding and this interesting gully in this area, and then all these this area of undisturbed soil based on all the features that you can see in the LiDAR. And then with metal detector survey and GPR, what we're able to do is begin to uncover some of the all the potential grave shafts that we found through survey in this area. So, and probably a better example of this even than the burial ground is the home farm. And then I think in week 2 you all are gonna Chris and Mac are gonna give you all a tour of the home farm. At the home farm, what we did is we did metal detector survey in this area, and where there are higher counts of iron objects, which are nails, that's where we're able to figure out where there are buildings. But at the same time, use the LiDAR maps to figure out where road traces are located and other landscape features are. So we're, with one of the things that we've been able to really get into is, not just looking at sites, individual sites, but pulling back and looking at these in a larger landscape context. And so with the metal detector surveys, with the LiDAR surveys, you're able to look at these sites and how they relate to each other, like how a woodlot, for example, at the burial ground relates to the larger landscape across a quarter of a mile. So there's with the work that you all are going to be doing this summer, you're going to be working in these 5 foot by 5 foot units, but all these are set into the context of the larger landscape through not only previous work that we've done, but also some of these larger surveys that we've done as well. So anybody have any questions about this? And I've covered a lot in like not even beginning what I could cover in about a half an hour, but yeah, Amanda.
So is the gully, forgive me, is the gully it has to do with water, right? What is the gully? Go ahead.
Gully, yeah,
I
thank
should
you.
just ask you, what is the gully?
These gullies right here are basically they're erosional gullies. They're basically ravines that are cut into. This is the top of the ridge right here.
Okay.
And then these are these deeply incised trenches that run downslope that were caused by all the water, with directional plowing, all the water being funneled into these steep slopes. And then this dendritic pattern, when they get to the mid part of the slope, it just completely erodes out this area. And then it washed all the soils into the bottomland where this stream is right here. So that's what I'm talking about with gullies.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Old English term, gully. So well, cool. I'll stop sharing screens, but yeah, like I said, I didn't want to get into a lot of the specifics of the sites because it's just overwhelming, some of the details and the history that we've gotten, but wanted to give you an overview of where we're at with the surveys that we've done. What's most visible on the landscape is this early 19th century landscape, but it's what makes the site we're looking at right now, the burial ground, so interesting. And I lied. I'm going to go back to sharing screens here for 1 second, because with the burial ground, what we've got with the burial ground, and this is something we're going to be looking at this summer, is you've got this landmass that's Montpelier, and you can see when you pull out on this map, you can see these deed lines. So for example, this deed right here is the original patent from the 1720s. And then this additional land right here is another piece of land that was added in the 1780s. This one was sold by James Madison Sr. in the 1820s. But what you've got is, this larger landmass that makes up Montpelier today. You would have had the enslaved working all across this landscape and sites being in different locations. But in terms of where folks buried their loved ones for the enslaved, it all focused in this burial ground right here. And so the woodlot that today is turn off this sites here. This woodlot today is the one site that for descendants of the enslaved, they know where their ancestors are buried. So we're thinking from the 1720s all the way up until 1844, the enslaved community buried all of their loved ones in this one spot. So you've got a compilation of community history in this area that we're beginning to look at. And we'll get into this when you all are here, arrive here next week. But my burial map went away. Let's see. For this site right here, and this has gone over in the story map, all the red dots that are here are from the ground penetrating radar, are indications of where burials are. And the number of burials that we found, we don't know whether, what part of the burial ground is older than the other, whether the area we're going to be working in, which is right in here, and this is something that that Henry Anglin and Allison James is going to be talking about. The MDC is looking to build a memorial outside of the burial ground in this section of the woodlot. And so that's why we're focused. Oh, somehow I muted myself. Can you all hear me? Okay, all right. I don't know how long I was muted. Hopefully not for long. So, but the area that's right in here is where this memorial is going to be built. And so we're focusing our excavations in this area. And we have no idea whether this is the oldest part of the burial ground or the most recent or somewhere in between. But what's interesting is you've got, a compilation of community history that's all in this one woodlot right there. So, so that's, it's, and what's exciting is the field school is going to be, the first time we've done really intensive excavations at the burial ground. So there's going to be a lot that we're going to be learning. We've only put in a couple of units over the past month just to give us an idea of what's there, but we'll be opening up a lot more in this area. So, but does anybody have any questions about any of this, or Chris and Liz want to add something to this? All right, well, I'll go ahead and stop sharing screens here. There we go, and get back to everybody here.
Well, I guess we can go ahead. Thanks, Matt, for giving that overview. You covered a lot pretty succinctly. So Liz and I are going to do a sort of Archaeology 101 lecture, which may be redundant for a lot of you, but it's good just to kind of go over our methods and definitions that we use for various concepts. All right, I'm going to do share screen. Also, I apologize for background sounds. There are contractors over and it's very loud. Someone interrupt me if sorry, I'm normally using multiple monitors and struggling with this. There we go. Right. There's another great picture of Liz, our lab director, in front of the temple, which Matt talked about. But we're going to start off with just some basic definitions. Archaeology, I know it's very simple answer, but in general, it's the study of humans through their material remains. And in your chapter 1 of Dietz's book kind of gets into some of the definitions of what those material remains are, but just a simple overview. It's anything physically left behind, and in general, that can be artifacts, it can be soil deposits, stratigraphy, buildings, the constructed landscape, as well as the natural landscape. And increasingly so, just general concepts of cultural landscapes or ideological landscapes are also part of all of the aspects that we include as archaeologists in kind of reconstructing our understanding of past human behavior. So what is historical archaeology? There is actually quite a lot of debate about that definition that go back to the origins of the discipline between English archaeologists and North American archaeologists and what that definition is. But most basically, it's a subdiscipline of archaeology that covers the time period in which there are both written and oral traditions that have clear through lines of the past into the present, or where those through lines of present issues or social structures have clear connections to the past. So some archaeologists will define that as the start of European colonization. Some people define it as the origins of capitalism, but there is not one clear definition for it. But that first line here in the PowerPoint is kind of the most basic definition there. So again, what is the archaeological record? That is comprised of all of those things I mentioned before. So that is, for us as historical archaeologists, documents, oral histories, that is cultural landscapes, artifacts, buildings, all of that becomes part of the archaeological record and is what we seek to not only document, but preserve and protect and mitigate if we need to in the field at large. And that record, when it comes to research and other things, becomes part of a data set, not to be too scientific about it, but um, that by being meticulous in the way that we record the archaeological record, whether it's through digital means, papers, maps, all of that become catalogs of artifacts, both in databases and on old cataloging sheet forms. That all becomes part of this comprehensive record of that past material culture and allows us to ask questions over time. We can ask new questions that previous archaeologists haven't asked from the same record or data sets and use a multitude of different approaches in how we assess it. The ways that we go about not only recovering archaeological records as well as the types of questions we ask is framed by methods as well as praxis, which is a jargony term that is basically the same as methods, but slightly different. Theoretical frameworks and general accepted ethics, and that can vary in country based off laws. There's all types of things that inform recovery strategies and the types of questions we ask and sort of the ethical backgrounds we bring to that process. So let's see here. So when it comes to all of those items, the methods, theories, ethics, and praxis, that makes up as well as our kind of approach to a archaeological record, whether that be a site, a collection of artifacts, a set of any set of resources that's sometimes called a project. Those are, I need to turn my volume off, I apologize. Those are what's sometimes referred to as the research design, which is composed of the types of questions and the methods we seek to apply to an archaeological record. And again, you can have multiple research projects with different research designs for the same data sets over time, and different archaeologists are going to have different approaches. And the more angles that archaeologists assess those archaeological records from, the more full that analysis and our understanding of human behavior in the past will be. Does anyone, well, I guess it's on the page, but did anyone familiar with the concept of provenience? I do not have people's faces up on the screen, so feel free to just chime in if you'd like.
I am.
All right, great. Go ahead.
Okay. Basically, provenience is like exactly where like something is found in the archaeological record, like the stratum, like the specific artifact, exactly where it is, like both depth and like I guess location wise. There's a better way to put it, but like exactly where it is in the context that it's in.
Yeah, that's great. That is perfect. The provenience, some people, the most basic definition, as you said, is the place, the context in which it is found. That is both vertical context in terms of, like Matt described, excavation units, how deep, what stratum was it found in. It's horizontal context, so where is it located on a landscape horizontally, and in relationship to other things or other items of the material record. Sometimes it also includes the entirety of its history, which is sometimes more referred to as provenance in the sort of art collector world, but that can be its place of origin in terms of manufacture and all of the steps it had in its life. The provenience at any given time is tied to its context. And for us as archaeologists, provenience is, at the end of the day, the most important thing in regards to the way we approach recording the archaeological record. There are lots of other things that are can be considered more important, but in terms of how we do research design and all of that and working with communities, but we are limited. The value of a material record, whether it's an artifact or document or what have you, is tied to its context. And so you will find here and other archaeological sites is we are very thorough and redundant in how we record that. So there's a whole complex set of alphanumerical systems, inventory systems, tracking forms that archaeologists use to make sure that we preserve provenience, even though we're removing artifacts from the ground. And so how I have listed here, archaeology is a destructive science. Does anyone know what we mean by destructive science? And again, feel free just to unmute and chime in.
It just means that like you can't repeat like excavation, so it sort of destroys everything as you uncover it.
Yeah, that's perfect. So in the sort of traditional scientific method, you're able to pose a question, control your variables, test it, repeat the experiment by tweaking variables, and we cannot do that with excavation. And there's kind of ways of controlling that, but in excavation, we are inherently, as you said, we're removing soil from the ground and you can't put everything back just as it was and be able to capture its full history and its context. And so without excavating carefully and recording everything, and as Matt mentioned, units, and I'll talk about a grid here in a moment, that provenience allows us, by preserving it, it allows us to ask better questions, to have a better record, and allow for better comparisons between sites, and again, have this sort of spatial information tied to an artifact. And so it's not just the object in and of itself. There are other methods to doing archaeology, and Matt's already talked about these, and we'll go more in depth into them next week, but LiDAR and ground penetrating radar, desktop assessments, oral histories, all kinds of things are methods that we can employ and do employ before you put shovel to ground so that you're minimizing the destructive nature of the archaeological research project. Sometimes parameters provide more opportunity for that, and sometimes there is less opportunity for it. But in general, we are also guided by preservation ethics, which like there's obviously tension there in being a destructive science and being preservationists at the same time. Hence why we use provenience as that method. All right, why is it not? Okay, there we go. So Matt, I won't spend too much time talking about sites, because Matt pretty much covered it, but in general, sites can be anything. They can be buildings, they can be work areas. Some of the sites that we have at Montpelier are wagon breakdowns that we've identified through metal detector survey. In a lot of context, one artifact in an area is enough to designate it as a site, historic site that is, if the artifact is, dated appropriately. But sites, the thing that's important to note is sometimes we are approaching sites as archaeologists, and so we have this whole modern lens to the approach. And we will come up with names or numbering systems that don't always reflect past human definitions for the space and usage of it. And that's but we have to use systems of control in order to kind of put boxes so that there's not endless scope creep on the sites that we're looking at, and also to be able to do scales of analysis. And sometimes we learn our definitions of site are wrong and we adjust them through time. And we can get into that more. So let's get through here. All right, so one of the systems, Matt already talked about units, but we use a gridded 5 by 5 foot system over the entire landscape. That said, there are different planes or grid planes that are used by archaeologists. They use different grid sizes. Some people use trenches. There's all kinds of different ways of creating spatial horizontal control. We have one grid system around the main house and then generally use the Virginia state plane for the rest of the property. And that just is due to the time period in which we started excavations around the main house. Going to breeze through just to make sure we have enough time to go over material culture and artifact stuff. While we're excavating within a 5 by 5 foot unit or sometimes a different size unit, we split our excavations based off visible stratigraphy. And that allows us to, again, have further detail about the provenience of an object. It also gives us a sense of the history and changes in the landscape and how human behavior affected and shaped that landscape, and also how the landscape kind of affected back on human behavior. And we can see all of those changes. Generally speaking, if everything is undisturbed or not fully disturbed, we can observe all of that. And we'll go over more on stratigraphy next week as well, much more in depth. You all will be doing a stratigraphy project due at the end of the field school. Features, archaeological features are another type of context. Again, I'll go over this in much more detail, but these are sometimes called, earth artifacts or non-movable artifacts. They can include cellars, post holes, foundations, fences, whole buildings. Generally speaking, it's when people dig a hole in the ground and fill it back in. We call it a feature. And it's different from a surface layer or deposit that is spread over a large space horizontally. And there's entirely different approaches or different methodologies applied to excavation of features. All right, so last thing here, kind of summing up provenience. I mentioned that we have a complex alphanumeric system in the United States that archaeologists use. You will be writing hundreds of times, probably this summer, on bags and on paperwork, something that looks very similar to this or various formats to this. But in general, we are the 44th state alphabetically in the United States. We are working in Orange County. The site we're working on this summer, which is 235, is the 235th site in Orange County registered with DHR. That's the Department of Historic Resources. A lot of places will also have a sort of letter code for the site, the larger site, an individual unit number for that 5 by 5 foot unit. If you have an archaeological feature, we have feature numbers, and these are dependent on sites. Some are contiguous across the property, such as units, and feature numbers are site specific. And then you have stratum letters, which are ways that we can assign a unique ID for each layer. And there's further depths of provenience to this that is more related to analysis, which we'll get to again next week. All right, so in handoff to Liz to talk about lab work. Basically, when we recover artifacts in the ground or any other archaeological samples, according to a collection strategy, which is usually part of the research design, that is the method in which you take soil samples, screen soils for artifacts, what types of artifacts you keep or do not keep, how you deal with the soil that comes out of the ground and put it back in the ground, all kinds of things. And generally, the process by which we take materials from the site to the lab is called accession. And that's where I'm going to hand it off to Liz.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm going to stop sharing. You can share as well.
Awesome. Let me start sharing. If I can find it. Here it is. Okay, so picking up where Chris left off, we take a number of archaeological samples in the field to collect data from material culture and soil in a variety of ways. And let me hide this floating panel so that we can see that. Okay, great. And so artifacts are objects and material culture that are made and used by humans. We consider portable artifacts to be the ones that can be easily moved. So think about the artifacts you see here. Ceramics, nails, glass, animal bone, as well as what we call small finds or unique artifacts like symbols, buttons, pipe stems, etc. We also collect architectural materials, the category we refer to our brick and stone material as, to better understand architectural decisions as well as possible grave markings or offerings. We also work with archaeological samples of dirt, pollen, phytolith or micro plant remains, and grit. We conduct in-house iron conservation to preserve iron objects from decay. And we also perform regular collections organization and management on existing collections to best preserve them for future generations to study from and learn from. So on the left here, and I'm just going through this really quickly, but we'll go through a lot more detail as we get into field school. But we have this flow chart for how artifacts and water screen samples move through the lab processes. Artifacts generally go from collection in the field to accessioning in the lab, and then a sample-specific process, and then to cataloging. And so what cataloging is where we extract data from the artifacts regarding everything from size and weight to condition, decoration, color, things like that. And I'm going to get you guys familiarized with all of these processes over the course of the days we get to work with each other in the field school. But the TLDR is essentially that artifact samples get washed, dried, sorted into categories, and then cataloged, while water screen samples go through a specific process of flotation of the charred and botanical remains, and then a gradient sorting process where we sort through the remaining grit materials by size, and then we pick through the grit, searching for small artifacts like beads and straight pins. And then these artifacts all get cataloged and put into final storage. The cataloging process is pretty time consuming, but it allows us to be able to use artifact data to create distribution maps of where specific groupings of artifacts are located across a site. And that's seen here in the distribution analysis map. And then we also are able to analyze our artifact assemblages like ceramics to understand interactions between groups of people on the plantation landscape, access to goods in the past, personal choice, use of specific vessel types, and so much more. And then what all these processes do together is allows us as archaeologists to work with architects, historians, architectural historians, curators, and other museum professionals to interpret the archaeological data and reconstruct not only buildings, but also landscapes across the plantation. And as you will learn over the course of field school here at Montpelier, we performed a number of reconstructions that have relied on the archaeological data, as Matt talked about and Chris talked about. And the combined efforts of the field and lab create this really beautiful synergy that creates this full restoration as pictured here when the South Yard was being reconstructed and when we were excavating a paling fence line that separated the stable yard and quarter from the South Yard here. But as we move through the landscape of Montpelier, both virtually and in person, you'll begin to learn about various sites on the property, including those that make up the home farm pictured here. And the archaeological survey and excavation we conduct have allowed us to more fully understand the landscapes that, the average visitor may just see as an agricultural field. But this data that we put together and the interpretive signs we put up and the reconstructed buildings on the property all start to kind of formulate this landscape that we can start to see through the archaeological data and the reconstructions on the landscape. So that kind of ties up my archaeological 101 spiel. I will stop sharing. And I know we're pretty close to time. We have 2 minutes before we're handing it over to Mr. Henry England from the MDC. So does anybody have any 2-minute questions before we... Oh yeah, Amanda.
You guys, this is so unimportant, but it's very brief. What is allergy wise? Have you guys are you in your blooming season right now, or have you guys are you on the middle of it, the other end of it? What to expect with that?
The pollen's pretty bad right now, I will say.
I know. Oh no. Okay, I'm prepared. I just wanted to know what to prepare for.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, definitely allergy meds are good to have on hand just in case.
Okay, I got it. All right. Thank you.
Good. And we also have poison ivy at the site. Matt's going to be spraying all that, so hopefully it's dead before you get here, but it's something to be aware of, and we'll go over how to identify it and avoid it and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely good to be aware of the bugs, the pollen, and the poison ivy, and be prepared for that. I think one thing we didn't even start with, but definitely at any point over the next couple of days, if you have questions about what kind of clothing to be bringing, definitely long sleeves with those shirts and pants. You're going to want that for working in the woods at the burial ground. So, but yeah, so uh, well, without further ado, wanted to introduce Henry Anglin. Henry is the chair of the memorialization committee. Henry's a descendant. His ancestral ties to Montpelier are on an adjacent plantation called Bloomfield, which is owned by the Newman family, and his family is descended from an area that they settled called Jacksontown, and so has known Henry and his family for quite a while, and worked with them, both in the archaeology and then more recently through his involvement with the MDC as a board member. And then Allison James just joined us. Allison is the project director for the memorialization project. And Henry and Allison, I gave everybody a little bit of background on the burial ground. They've read the story map that goes into more details on that. But what we framed, the burial ground is the context of the larger Montpelier plantation. But wanted to have Henry and Allison talk with you all about what the memorialization project is, and why we're doing the field school, which is to be able to define where the edge of the burial ground is and where the memorial can be built. So Henry and Allison, I'll turn it over to you all.
Okay. I grew up in that area, and I ran through those woods, and pulled ticks off of myself later, and ran through poison ivy. Fortunately, at that time, it didn't really bother me, but that was before everybody started realizing the effects of some of those kinds of things. It didn't mean anything way back then, except for little irritations. But other than that, that was it. Fortunately, I didn't have allergy problems. That was one of the things. I hope I don't duplicate. I don't think I will duplicate some of the things that you may have talked about. And as we go along, if you have any questions, just ask, okay? The Montpelier Descendants Committee, or the MDC, is an organization that's made up of descendants of the enslaved in Orange County and the Central Virginia area. And also, there are members who are interested in supporting the efforts, not necessarily those who had ancestors at Montpelier, but supporting the effort and telling the story of the history of the enslaved and America. When I was growing up again, I didn't, your age at least, uh, I didn't really go to burial grounds or cemeteries often. Only occasionally would I go to the burial grounds or cemeteries with my parent or relative. And I remember on one occasion, I went to a cemetery in Martinsville, Virginia, which is where I was born, actually. And the cemetery was not really well kept at all. And we spent a great deal of time going around trying to find markers. And we did find the one marker that we were looking at, but it took a lot of effort. As a matter of fact, I had a similar experience in this area as well. There's a cemetery that's not far from Montpelier where many members of my family where I grew up in this area, and on my mother's side, the family was from this area. But I was at that cemetery, and again, I had a similar experience just trying to find the locations of family members. I found one marker, and that was it. And that kind of led me to go to various sources to find more information about the actual sites and the locations and things like that. So just, those are kinds of things that kind of relate to the things that relate to the burial ground. I don't know, when you first started, I don't know who you are as far as um, uh, you being the members of the field schools or potential members of the field school. And I'd be interested, take a little time to find out a little bit, not necessarily go through everybody and find out everyone's name. I don't think we actually have time for that. But I'm curious to see if any of you has similar experiences as far as visiting cemeteries, and what how did that affect you, and or maybe how did it affect your parents? Just kind of leave it open to get a little feedback from you. Everybody's quiet here.
I visited a cemetery in Dayton, Virginia, and the area had completely eroded to the point that they didn't even know where the grave sites were anymore. And it was like kind of a community project where they brought in cadaver dogs to like mark the potential burial spots so that they could like restore the cemetery and clean it up. So there's like a group of us that kind of like worked together to clear the brush, and then the cadaver dogs came in and marked the spots, and then they did some GIS mapping there. But it was a really meaningful project, and it was great for the community, really impactful.
I have a similar experience. My folks are from Teague, Texas, and so this summer I'm going to preserve our old burial ground, which maybe dates back to slavery, but we're not really sure. And so I was there this spring break, and it was really interesting because I went with like my great uncle, and he showed me like, this is where I plan to be buried. And then he was like, I think someone may already be here, so if you can check that out for me. So definitely like that connection to like, not only are these burial grounds important, but they're still being used, and like people are still visiting them all the time.
So it is. So it's really important to them, especially your parents. And as you get older, it'll probably be more and more important to you as well. But it's very important to a lot of people. The memorialization committee, as we met, we've been meeting for a year and a half, almost 2 years, actually bi-weekly all that time. So it's a lot of meetings. And, the committee has expressed many feelings about the burial ground here at Montpelier. I know on original discussions that we had when we first started up, some felt that the burial ground should be left untouched, as it as it had been for several years. One person expressed that they were on their original visit there years ago. They expressed how they were really moved looking at the trees, the silence, the plants that were there. And as we went along, we had, and had further discussions. It was realized that the original area that we had looked at was much larger than expected. And I guess probably talked a little bit about that a little bit earlier, maybe. Certainly now we're looking at possibly 250 or so burials there. So it's much larger than we had anticipated when we started. Some of the trees and the growth and those kinds of things are a little different today than they were in earlier years. And then with the additional data that we have, we came to understand that the site looked different and than it previously did. And so essentially they started having different ideas about what it is that we thought of the ground itself, and then what it was that we wanted to plan for as far as a memorial or anything like that. So a lot of that had changed. However, the basic concepts remained the same, I think. They wanted a place that was a place of respect. They wanted a place of remembrance. They wanted a place of honor and reverence, a place that could lead to the telling of the history of the ancestors. The MDC members feel very strongly about the significance of this site. Just want to make sure I emphasize that. And also some visitors to Montpelier that didn't have ancestors that were enslaved here, upon visiting the site, they expressed a connection with their families as well. So it affected them as well. And I guess what I'm expressing is, or emphasizing here, is that is the importance to many of your work in this area. And as you're doing that, it's important to them that you be respectful of the area itself, and that your work is extremely important to them. Additionally, and Allison will talk a little bit about where we are at this particular point in time, which is really working toward constructing a memorial for this space. And but in addition to that, in the future, we're looking at expanding our efforts as far as memorialization is concerned beyond the burial ground to basically the entire landscape where the enslaved, they worked, they endured, they raised families, and they made it possible for James Madison to have resources and the time to help write the Constitution. So again, I'm just really trying to emphasize to you the importance of your work and your contributions to the things that are important to everyone there at Montpelier. Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit to kind of bring everybody up to speed as to where we are at this particular point in time. Yes.
Okay. Give me a signal, a sign, everybody wave, whatever. Liz, text me if you can't hear me, because I am on the road to New Jersey today.
We hear you. Hear you loud and clear, and we can see you real well.
I'm sorry for that, Matt. I'm sorry for that, Matt. No, just kidding. So I'm on my way unfortunately, to a funeral in New Jersey for one of the MDC board members' spouses. So I'm going to go and support. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll talk about my role, and then I'll talk about the process. So I am Memorialization Project Director. I was hired by the MDC a year and a half ago. And I've been working in cultural landscapes in different parts of the world, in preservation of cultural landscapes, for the past 15 years. I was hired by the MDC to come in and make sure that their vision is realized, that their vision is intact, and that it's built, I studied landscape architecture, and then I studied architectural history and all cultural landscape focused. With I've been working with anthropologists, archaeologists in Liberia most recently, and before that in Hyderabad, India, with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. So a lot of work with archaeologists. Always looking to work with archaeologists. Still hear me? You guys are frozen. Good. Let me turn off my camera.
All good.
Yeah, we can hear you, Allison.
Okay. Okay.
We're all nodding.
Okay. So I love. Oh, good. Okay. So I'm always happy when the interns. I mean, this is my second time the interns have arrived, because it's just a pretty awesome experience for everyone at Montpelier to have you on site. So consider yourselves welcome and loved, and we're here and we're excited to have you. I can tell you that the process of memorialization started in 2019 before I got here. The MDC got together, and you probably have already heard about the rubric. If not, you will hear more about it. And then structural parity, which is the
We lost you, Allison. Okay. I think you're muted, Allison.
I think you're back now, Allison. Yeah.
Okay. I turned off my camera so that you could probably hear me better.
We can hear.
All right. Okay. So I'm not going to go into the whole relationship between the organizations and all of that. That's something that you'll read about and you'll study about and you'll understand by the time you get up and running, if not already. But what I will say is that the process of figuring out first what the memorial should be has come from the MDC. First of all, the memorialization committee led by Henry England got together, and a small group met to figure out what the structure of memorial would be like conceptually. What would it look like conceptually? What it would look like spatially, and then what it would commemorate, and then all of the different aspects of that memorial before we even started digging into possibilities. And so from there, their document was a beautiful document, and we can share that with you. That started to guide conceptual framework for the sort of direction that we were headed in. And that looked like looking at precedent studies to determine what, just sort of look at the landscape of memorials. What does the larger landscape of memorials look like in different contexts? What does it look like in, we looked at UVA, we looked at the Vietnam Memorial, we looked at, the different memorials that have been built at different time periods. We looked at everything from monuments to landscapes, to monuments and landscapes, to largely then architectural projects, to landscape architecture. And we sort of and started to pull out elements of those memorials and connect them to exactly what the committee had stated that they will make sure that they see. And so line for line, we pulled out elements that match to all of the guidelines for memorialization. And so over time, we've gotten to about time. I think we've been at it for a year and a half, visioning, spending time in across the landscape, really, in different contexts, spending some quiet time at the burial ground, talking every other week over Zoom, and then really continuing to shape that vision so that it is really their vision. And so we can honestly say now that we got to a place where we put out an RFQ, request for qualifications, for firms to submit an initial proposal. We got a bunch of proposals, and then we turned around and reviewed those with a committee. And now we put out a request for proposals, which will then turn around 2 months from now. We have a short list of firms that were chosen, and they were chosen based on community engagement, description, technical ability, design language, how well do they match, diversity of staff members, and sort of across the board, a deeper understanding of the conceptual themes that the committee is really looking for. And so we are going to start designing, meaning the design team, whoever that is, and whoever wins, we'll start designing with the MDC. We'll also have some town halls. Also involve Professor Andrea Roberts from UVA, who's leading the Arc of Communities, which is a big community outreach initiative from the MDC and with the MDC. And so this whole thing will start to take shape at the burial ground once you all have cleared a space. So we have sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 different spaces, 4 potential sites to start the memorial. And then that will be a discrete memorial. It will be inclusive of walkways and pathways, and it'll be its own complete built memorial. But we also imagine that could be built, there could be nodes that are connected to it. So it could be the first piece, a crown jewel, the piece that allows everyone that space to memorialize their ancestors. And then we start to build out from there. So that is that in a nutshell. So timeline, you guys are going to work really hard this summer. We know that for sure. We appreciate it. And then by August 15th, we'll start to design. We'll have like 9 months of design time. So that gives archaeology a good period of time to clear the way, to make sure that there are no anomalies, burials, anything that could be disturbed. And so please open it up for questions. We love to hear from you guys.
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things. Just reiterate what I guess Allison is saying. You know, we did get a grant from the Mellon Foundation to that we could use toward building a memorial. And when we're looking at a memorial, I guess the thing that's important is a memorial can be a lot of different things in people's minds. It can be a big monument. It could be, you know, all kinds of big structures and things like that. We're really looking for something that would fit within the landscape. As we work toward this, and Allison had mentioned structural parity, that's basically working along with all parties that's concerned here. That's Montpelier Foundation, us, the National Trust, National Park Service, the firms that we're bringing in. There are various groups that all are involved in this. And the important thing, as far as, and Allison mentioned this, important thing as far as your contribution is concerned, and the reason that we're doing the work there at the burial ground is really to determine the extent, and I know you've heard this, the extent of the burials. We need to have a very good picture of where the burials are located or aren't located, because whatever area we use to place the memorial, we want to make sure it's in an area that's that there are no grave shafts or anything like that. And so it's really extremely important with the information that will be obtained from your work. It's extremely important. And as far as the memorial is concerned, I mean, we want, like I said earlier, we want a space that people can really come, pay their respects, be to a certain extent an area where people can sit and reflect, but also we want to be able to share a certain amount of history as a part of that. If you think about it, you'll have descendants coming there, but you'll also have visitors coming there. And we want to make sure that they understand the significance of the site and the contributions that the enslaved made as well. And those are some of the kinds of things we're looking at as far as the memorial is concerned. Questions that we can answer at this time. I know I didn't answer every question that you had.
We've been dumping a lot of information on folks, so it might be overload. But this is, you know, what Henry and Allison were.
Yeah, but the important.
Oh, I interrupted.
No, I was going to say the important thing is that. No, that's all right. That's it. The important thing is that it really just, again, I just want to emphasize that your work is really important to a lot of people. And I want to also emphasize that, people have a lot of different opinions in terms of their feelings about burial sites. And so, that's why we keep emphasizing being respectful and those kinds of things. So as we go along, if you have any additional questions at any particular point in time, I think I'll get a chance to meet most of you in about a week's time. And maybe then you'll have some questions that, since you had a whole week to think about it. And also more experience there.
I'll be around
and Allison will be there.
And site, and I can answer any questions you guys have. I'll be in Liberia for a week and a half, but I'll be back and excited to meet you and talk with you and find out more about you personally. Sorry, and you'll meet Mila. She's my little sidekick here. So, yep, excited to have you guys here.
And our committee is made up of the memorialization committee. It's made up of a lot of different people. Some people who all of them are descendants, but some actually live in the Orange area. you have on our committees, we have authors. We have, yeah, and you will meet Dr. Blakey, Michael Blakey. He's a part of our committee. He did a lot of work with the African burial ground in New York City. We've got a variety of folks. I mean, that's essentially what I'm saying. So I think that as we go along, any questions you have, we can probably answer those. All right. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Allison. Tomorrow, like you mentioned, Allison, we're going to talk about the clientage model and how that relates to public archaeology and community archaeology, and how it really defines the role of, who is the decision maker. And in this case, the decision maker on the archaeology is the descendant, the MDC. They're the ethical client, the group that has, the most at stake in what we're doing. And in that way, the MDC is making a decision on not only what the goals of the archaeology are, but how that archaeology takes place. So everything that we're doing, from where we set up the screens, where we have the work areas, all that we've reviewed with the MDC. And even, how we take pictures or we don't take pictures, that's all been reviewed by the memorialization committee, by a group of advisors that we have that are made up of MDC and other local community members. But then the final say, a lot of times it will come down to talking with Henry in a meeting, and Henry will say, well, we have, the memorialization committee recommends this, but we really need to take this to the board, to the MDC board for a vote. And we'll get into this tomorrow, like how all this plays itself out, and how, in a lot of ways, structural parity works with this project. And what's exciting about this project is this is the first big project that the MDC as a nonprofit and the Montpelier Foundation has engaged in with structural parity. And it's a project that in many ways really would be very difficult to happen without structural parity, because we're talking about, the burial ground of the ancestors. And I would say there are no spaces that are more sacred than that. And to be doing archaeology in, using just a standard academic model would be so disruptive, and so it'd be a lot of injury that could happen to everyone involved, to the relationship, to people's trust. And so we worked really hard on, how to set up this work. That we've been planning for the archaeology for as long as we've been planning for the memorial. And again, we'll get into some of the history of that tomorrow in talking about the clientage model. But wanted to start out, really appreciate you, Henry, and you, Allison, taking time.
I was thinking about one other thing.
Yeah.
I know that most people on here probably have not been to Montpelier before. I would assume most of the field school.
Who's been to Montpelier? Raise your hand.
Okay, so just
Chris and Liz have been there.
I was thinking about the question that came up earlier about the allergies and things like that, and you were talking about what to wear and all of. I want to make sure that you understand. To get to the burial ground, you're not going to be walking through miles and miles of trees and brush and all of that. It's right next to one of the entrance roads and things like that. So I just wanted to make that clear. You might have had an idea from the discussion that you're really going to be moving, much further afield than you actually are. So.
No, thanks, Henry.
I hope that answers that. That helps. So.
Well, cool. This wraps up this today's session. Liz and Chris, do y'all have anything else to add, or Henry or Allison?
The only thing I have is, has everyone had an okay time accessing all the readings? Have you all had any permission issues? Okay, good. There's bound to be one article that doesn't have good proper permissions, but I'm trying to stay ahead of it.
And Henry and Allison, if y'all want to take the course, let us know. We'll send you the syllabus.
Matt, every day that I'm in the office with you, I take the course. So I always appreciate you. So
All right, thank you, Allison.
Okay, everybody, take care.
Drive safe, Allison.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
All right, well, we'll see you all tomorrow at 3:00. And appreciate you all doing the readings and being prepared for the discussions. And any questions you have and you want to shoot us an email, feel free to do that. So, all right, thanks everybody. Thanks again, Henry. All right, bye everybody.